It's very nice of you to have me out here tonight. I want to thank the Blavitt family for arranging for these wonderful lectures, both Ron and your late wife, Susan, who founded this lecture series. I want to thank Nancy. There you are, my boss, sort of, executive producer of the Chris Matthews Show. By the way, this is the only poster that ever says the Chris Matthews Show first, and then it says Hardball. So we got your priorities right out here at Gettysburg. Caroline, there you are, Caroline Nathan. I want to thank the guy who drove me out here, Bob Monahan, who has many other capabilities and skills, but one of them was being good company, coming out here. His beautiful wife, Laurie, and his daughter, Kate Monahan, of this school. Thank you, Kate. And they're friends of mine. And then I want to thank Professor Mott, of course, and Professor Shirley Warshaw, who was mentioned, and the president of your college. Delightful. Thank you, Janet Riggs, and Chris Zappa, who's the provost. Where's the provost? There, second row, huh? Someday up front here. Someday you'll be up front here. A smaller school, of course, but you'll be right up front. Somewhere else. I think it's great. I don't know how the high schools are doing in this neighborhood, by the way. And that was probably the worst. No, it wasn't. That's one of the best imitations of Kennedy I can imagine. Anyway, thank you. It got a big hand, and obviously people have forgotten what he sounded like. Anyway, I think it's great to be here, and I want to talk about my hero, Jack Kennedy, because I've written this book, and it's now right behind Bill O'Reilly, and I hope to pass him on the inside turn. Right behind O'Reilly. I don't think I'm going to catch... I'm in third place. The Times coming out next week. I'm in third place. Wall Street Journal, NPR, Publisher Weekly. But who's counting, you know? And I'm hoping, I don't think I can catch Steve Jobs because the whole timeliness of that book makes me very curious about how that book came out at just the time. Anyway, enough of that. 2 years ago, the American people were asked who they thought should be on Mount Rushmore joining President Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and the great Teddy Roosevelt, and they said Jack Kennedy. And I want to tell you that that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, the sense that we had a hero as a president, not just a politician, but a hero. And one of the most important things to talk about when you talk about an American hero is a rite of passage. And anybody who studies literature knows what that is. It's a point in your youth where you show your physical courage. It tends to be the sine qua non of an American hero. Whether you're Davy Crockett and you killed yourself a bar when you're only 3, or whatever happens. You're Hemingway and you were killed, or almost killed in an ambulance when you're riding in an ambulance around in the First World War, even before we were in it. Or you're if you're Winston Churchill and you escaped the Boers in the Boer War, you have to do something early in life to begin that arc of the rite of the hero in American life. And of course, Jack Kennedy did that better than anybody. At 2 o'clock in the morning in the South Pacific, when there was no stars, no moon, no radar on his boat, on his PT boat, he thought he saw something sort of off there. And within seconds, his boat, his plywood PT boat, was cut in half by a Japanese destroyer 11 feet from him. He thought this was what it's like to die. He thought the crash of the ship as it passed through so close to him. His end of the boat was still floating. The other end was sinking and drifting quickly away, and he dived in the water and rescued the 42-year-old engineer who was badly burned at the time, Pappy McMahon. Pappy wanted to give up, and Jack Kennedy wouldn't let him give up. He dragged him through the high seas there in the middle of the Pacific to the part of the boat that was still floating. And this is all in pitch black. And then he found another guy, Harris, who was about to give up. He had badly beaten up leg. He wanted to give up. And Kennedy said, for a guy from Boston, you're putting on quite an exhibition out here. And he saved that guy against his will. These are scenes almost out of movies where guys were ready to give up. Go on, Skipper, I can't make it. And he insisted on saving the lives of those two guys. He got them on the boat. Imagine this, you're surrounded by burning gasoline, the sound and the smell of that, and the water all burning around you, and he did it pretty courageously. He got them on the boat began to sink during the night, it turned turtle-like. He knew the boat wouldn't last long, so they had a little meeting on top of the boat, upside down PT boat, what was left of it, and he said, what are we going to do here? There's nothing in the handbook about this, and I have nothing to lose, nothing to live for, actually, and they thought that an odd statement to make for a Kennedy. His father was one of the 4 richest people in the world. And he said, you guys have families, you guys ought to make the decision. So anyway, they decided that they were going to go for the furthest island away, because the Japanese at that point, if you've read Unbroken, were getting hold of people and torturing them very slowly, and to their joy, to death. They didn't let American prisoners even die nicely. The Japanese were terrible when it came to prisoners. They didn't keep them, they tortured them, and they knew that was facing them if the Japanese got them. They were in Japanese waters. And so they found the smallest island they could think of. They swam. Kennedy basically took the 4 guys that couldn't swim. He ordered the 5 guys who could swim to hold on to the same plank so the 4 guys who couldn't swim would make it. And they had 4 miles to go through high seas. And then he said, I'll take care of McMahon. At which point he pulled out his knife and cut out the strap of McMahon's life jacket, put it in his teeth, put McMahon on his back. Now, of course, his back had been terrible before the war. He should have never gotten in the Navy. And his back was almost killed again during the concussion of the other ship. And he put him on his back and carried him in the water for 4 hours through the South Pacific to this island. When he got to the island, he managed to drag himself up onto the island. He had kept the crew together on the plank they were holding on to so the non-swimmers could make it. He vomited, fell asleep for a half hour, woke up and said, I'm going out tonight. And he swam out that night with a flashlight and a .38, looking for some American boats to come by. He was hoping he could catch them that night. He gets washed away to a sandbar. I mean, way out in we're talking about way out in the ocean here. And he swims back to the island with the other crew as he puts McMahon on his back again, gets the rest of the group together with the same plank, gets to another island. He doesn't find any water there. They need to find water and not find Japanese. He finally goes to a 3rd island, finds water, brings it back. By that time, some natives from the local area have come, and they're saved. He kept his crew together. He wouldn't go back home until he'd gotten his entire crew back home with him. He was quite the skipper, and word about that kind of loyalty to your crew gets around. So that's how he ran for office. He was the only guy who ran for Congress who was a real war hero against a bunch of guys that hadn't served. So that's how it started. What I give him credit for, not just saving his crew, but saving this planet we live on, because what happened in 1962 is still the most frightening moment in the history of our planet. It's when we came so close to nuclear war. The Soviet Union had secretly put 90 nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba. We found out about it. The military wanted to attack. Curtis LeMay, who had leveled Japan during World War II, wanted to attack. Admiral Shoup, another member of the Joint Chiefs, wanted to attack. McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Council director, wanted to attack, as did Douglas Dillon, the Secretary of the Treasury, was another close member of Kennedy's team. Kennedy thought, well, wait a minute. Khrushchev said if we attack Cuba, he's taking Berlin. If he takes Berlin, we've got to go to first use because they outnumber us on the ground, 350,000 Red Army troops to 15,000 combined NATO troops. We'd have a few hours to go before we had to go to first use of nuclear to save Berlin. And I'm committed to saving Berlin. So I'm not going to start that chain reaction. And he basically decided not to invade against all the power around him, all the influence of all these top generals with all their medals and scrambled eggs and everything else they had going for them. And that was, to me, the most important decision. It turns out that if he had invaded, Khrushchev said in his memoirs, and this is how close it got. Nobody knew at the time how close it had gotten. Khrushchev said if he had 1 or 2 missiles left over, and he had intermediate-range missiles on Cuba, of the 90 he had there, he was going to hit New York. And he said, I might not kill everybody in New York. He might have succeeded almost. But he said, if I didn't kill everybody in New York, I'd kill a lot of people, and I'd teach America what it's like to fight a war in its own territory. It also turned out he had 43,000 troops on the island of Cuba, not 10,000, so it would have been a bit of a land battle there if we had landed 150,000 troops. And of course, he would have gone for Berlin in all likelihood. And then we would have gone to first use if he hadn't already gone. This is how close it came. I know that the Catholics at the school I went to the year before were all in confessional lines. Everybody thought it was it. Anybody who was in college at the time knows what the mood was. We were that close. And this president managed to make the right decision against all the powerful people around him. And so when I went to write this book, I wanted to answer 2 questions. One, it was the question he said was the reason people read biographies. What's he like, or she like? What's it like to be in the room with this person? What's it like to go drinking with them, hang out with them, be their friend? What's that like, the experience of this other person? Not what's it like to be around a politician or a president. What's it like to be around this guy? What was Kennedy like as a guy? And the second thing I wanted to answer was, how did he get from being the rich kid's rich guy's kid to being this guy that was so wise? How did he get from being Joe Kennedy, of all people, all the awful people on this planet, how did he get from being that guy's son to being this big world thinker? This guy who was pro-Nazi, a Nazi sympathizer, an anti-Semite. How did he get from that guy, narrow person, who basically didn't even want to support the Marshall Plan after World War II because he thought it'd be good for American business and for his business if Europe went communist. It would make more markets for him. He was an awful person. And so how did his son get out from under him? So I started to track it. I had some very good evidence. I had the people around him. I knew all his best friends were from having written Kennedy and Nixon, the guys closest to him, his pals who he was loyal to from high school, from prep school at Choate to college roommates, to war buddies, to people I'd made friends with around the time of the war. And I could get to them, and so I could sort of bring him alive, like in Theater in the Round. I could have all these guys tell me what he was like, and then in the middle I could sort of project him back to life. That's what I really wanted to do in this book, is bring him back to life. I also came across the fact that he kept a diary back in 1946 in his first race, which hardly anybody knows about, that he began to write his memoirs, which nobody seemed to ever pay attention to, which I found them in the presidential tapes. I also came across 64 oral history recordings by Kenny O'Donnell, his top campaign strategist for all the races starting at 52. Nobody else had that. I went through the president's tapes he kept, which nobody seemed to know. Kennedy kept tapes, not just Nixon. He had a lot of tapes of what happened in the White House. And so I began to build the case of what he was like. And I wanted to tell the story of what he was like in school. What he was in high school was a troublemaker. But he was also a sick kid. Jackie Kennedy knew her husband in ways that spouses tend to know their spouse. They'd been married 10 years. Jackie lost her husband at Dallas when he was killed. She was the same age he was when he died that he was when he first looked at her. There was an age difference. She was 34 when he died. He was 34 when he first met her. So there was a real age difference to begin with, about 12 years. Jackie had her husband figured out, and I tell you, if anybody has any doubts about the whole aspect of who he was, she had him completely figured out, and she accepted it. Let's see. She said he wasn't this handsome, good-looking guy that had the world handed to him. He wasn't God's lucky child. From the time he was a kid, he was sick most of the time and lonely. And she also pointed out, from her perspective, his mother never loved him. She loved being the mayor's daughter of Boston. She loved being the ambassador's wife to Great Britain, but she didn't love her son. That's what Jackie said right after he was killed. So what else did she say? She said he was a kid who read a lot, read history. History made Jack. So when he was a young boy, he had scarlet fever, he had asthma. For a long time in high school, he thought he had leukemia. He didn't think he'd live that long. And he read all the time. History made Jack, is what Jackie said, and he had heroes because he was always confined to his bed. He was always either in infirmary or in some Boston or Rochester, Minnesota hospital, all the time sick. As Bobby said, if a mosquito ever bit my brother, the mosquito would have died instantly because all he ever was sick. He was always lonely. Nobody ever came to visit him from the family. His mother never once in 4 years visited him in high school, even though he thought he had leukemia. I just talked to Gina's sister the other day, and she said, well, it's because my mother was busy with Rosemary, who had the mental problems, didn't have time to visit her son. Well, he didn't see it that way. He said, what kind of a mother is she? She's always heading off somewhere. He'd cry to his roommate, Lem Billings, the son of a doctor from Pittsburgh, and talking about, my mother's constantly leaving me alone here. And so he began to form one friend in his life, Lem Billings. Now, Lem Billings became his friend for life. Lem actually had a room at the White House. Think about that. The whole time Jack was president, this other guy, besides his wife, had his room at the White House. As Joe Kennedy said, he moved in with his tattered suitcase and never left. He had that good friend his whole life. That was the basis of his sense that he could be a leader, and he formed a group called the Muckers in high school. Now, the Muckers had an interesting derivation. The headmaster, George St. John, didn't think much of rich Catholics, nouveau rich Catholics, so he used to refer to them as muckers. Actually, the troublemakers in school he called muckers. And muckers was an anti-Irish term. It meant the people that cleaned up the horse crap in Boston. They were the muckers, the poor people. And so he called them a bunch of muckers. The kids were causing trouble, and Jack heard that and caught a little ethnic attitude in it. So he found a group called the Muckers. and became the biggest troublemakers on campus. They were caught when they were finally, the word got out that they were going to dump a bunch of horse manure on the dance floor, someplace like this, for the big spring dance, and then come in and clean it up and be the heroes. Well, they were caught. Joe got them off the hook by promising the school he'd buy 2 movie projectors for them, which was Jack made a point of only letting kids in the club we knew had so much money, their parents had given so much money to the school, they couldn't be expelled. So then he decided to go legit in high school, and he had this group of 12 people as his gang, and he decided they're all going to become like, they're going to take over the yearbook, as you know what that's like. You take over the yearbook, you have to name all your friends best, most likely this, most likely that, most likable this. So he got himself elected most likely to succeed. And he got Lem elected most likable, and and nobody knows how they fixed the election. It may have been they just all agreed to vote for each other and vote traded. So he goes to college, he gets sick again, he can't finish at the London School of Economics, he gets sick, he goes to Princeton, can't finish there, gets sick again, finally ends up at Harvard, his third choice. Isn't that great, Harvard? Safety school. Anyway, he ends up at Harvard and gets sick again. The only sport he can learn is swimming, which comes in handy, obviously. And he gets so sick he can't even go to swim practice, but his new roommate, Tory McDonald, sneaks him out for steaks and ice cream to build up his weight and gets him some practice in, but he's most of the time in the infirmary again, always sick. He had 2 problems. One was his stomach, which was always causing trouble. He had a knot in his stomach. They thought it was leukemia for a long time. Then it ended up being, they thought it was colitis. And then they treat him with steroids. Imagine steroids for about 20 years, what that does to you. Would end up breaking down his bone structure. So in the early 50s, his whole skeletal form started to degenerate. Bob Dowd did the best work on this, the historian. Got the family medical records out on that. I have to give him credit for that. And Jack was, well, he got into Congress afterwards. He becomes a war hero. His brother gets killed in the war. And a good story about his brother, I came across a guy who went to school with him at Choate. So they bumped into him down at Jacksonville doing aviation training, and he was a Navy flyer. And he knew the reputation of Joe Sr. of being pro-Nazi and anti-Semitic, and he asked him, what are you going to do? He said, Joe Jr. said, I'm going to go over there and kill Nazis, and I'm going to get them in their bullpen. And that's what happened when he got killed, trying to get them in their bullpen, trying to get the V-3 rockets, I think, at the time. And so he became a victim of the war. Jack lost his brother-in-law, was killed. Billy Hartington, the husband of his sister, his beloved sister we liked the most, gets killed at the end of the war, and then she gets killed in a plane accident in 1948. So all around him, his siblings are dying around him. He comes out of the war. He spends practically a year in the Navy hospitals because of his bad back. And all the time he's got these steroids working on his stomach and his system. 1947, after getting elected to Congress, he has the last rites for the first time. I'll just go through his sicknesses, which will blow you away. You think this guy had it made. In 1947, he has the last rites of our church, which is, as Catholics here know, you only get at the very last minute, pretty much the 11th hour extreme unction. He got that because he had his first episode of Addison's disease, which destroys your adrenal system, and you can't really take a shock. And then, of course, he had the second round of that, and the second last rites in 1951, when he was on a Far East trip, and Bobby saved him by getting him to a Navy hospital in Okinawa, a military hospital. That saved him. He had the last rites the third time when the operations all went bad on his back, and even Nixon was crying at that. He was pretty friendly with Kennedy at the time, and he was crying. A Secret Service agent told me that. So everybody thought he was a goner by 54. They were already planning in Massachusetts who to run in that seat. It was over. I mean, the guy's life was just a series of these near misses with his back, and even in the Navy, he's wearing a sciatic belt, a kind of a corset, and he was sleeping on tables or on plywood sheets, whatever he could, because he couldn't sleep on a regular bed, and he never could really. And as president, they used to take him on a cherry picker and put him up in the planes because he couldn't walk upstairs, and he was always wearing crutches most of his life. And this is the weird life he lived. And by the time he was president, he was getting 6 shots of Provocaine every day just to be able to walk. This life of his was kind of strange, and he kept it all from us. A classic World War II guy. Never complain, never explain. Classic World War II mentality. Never, ever complain, never explain. It's not the public's business that he was sick all the time. His political career began because his brother was killed. The plan was for him to go into politics. Jack wanted to go in anyway. He got a chance to go in. Another thing that's been wrong, Jack was very political. As I said, he was reading Churchill when he was, did I tell you he was reading Churchill, History of World War I. By the time he was 14, read the whole account of World War I, read the New York Times every day in high school, and then analyzed it, laid down and analyzed it, trying to figure out each article. Was talking politics all through the war in the South Pacific. The guy from, his commanding officer was from New Jersey. He kept saying, well, how are the politics going in New Jersey? He wanted to know everything about politics. He was going to he ran for student council the first and second year at Harvard. And you know what those kind of guys are like, the ones that run every year. Familiar figures. And then he was going to law school. Everything was aiming towards a political career, despite what people say. In fact, his three closest friends told me this guy was headed to politics from the beginning, as sick as he was. He began to fill out. He looked better as he got older. He was young. They called him Rat Face because he was so skinny. I don't know what rat face had to do with skin. He had big ears that stuck way out, and he was really skinny. Guess who else has that? The President of the United States right now. It doesn't seem to stop you much in your career. The strange life, always sick, always a private sort of guy, lonely most of his life, and that really pretty much defined him, his career. He hated being alone. He always had to have somebody around. And when he became President of the United States, he used to insist that his assistant Dave Powers, stay with him till 11 o'clock every night and put him in bed. And he would say his prayers at his bedside. Now, Dave Powers told me this, and I said, yeah, right. He says his prayers at the side of his bed every night, kneels down and says his prayers, yeah, right. Turns out Jackie said the same exact thing, and she said it sort of mockingly, that he was superstitious. So this is the other thing about him that's so fascinating. He was a real devotional Catholic, even though he had all these girlfriends, which is, I thought, an odd contradiction until I met the Archbishop of New York, and he looked at me like, what else is new? And I told him this. He said, what else is new? Guys that do this stuff and still try to be Catholic or whatever. And he would light a candle for his brother. He would kneel at the graves of his lost sister and his lost son who died in 63, actually, Patrick, who only lived a few hours. He would go to confession all the time, right to the end. He'd even have the Secret Service hold a place for him. And I heard another theory that he would get guys with New England accents like yours to wait in line so he could sneak in among them. Because one time a priest said, "Good evening, Mr. President," in confession. He didn't like that. But here's a guy, this is how interesting he was. He was a girl chaser. He used to call it girling. He said, they're not going to catch my girling. And he had all these girlfriends and everything else going on. He had Jackie, who he seemed to have a real relationship with. But he had that too. And he was a real devotional Catholic who went to church every day, every Sunday, his whole life. Never, even when nobody was looking. He did it certainly in the Navy. He'd go to the other island. In high school, he'd go into town in Wallingford, Connecticut. He was very devotional. He was a real intellectual, and yet most of his friends thought he was just fun to hang out with. He was deep down an intellectual guy. Gene Kennedy Smith, his last surviving sibling, told me last summer that what made him different from all the rest of the Kennedys was that he was always sick, always reading, and he became an intellectual. She said the importance of sports have been overplayed. He was much better off being an intellectual because he didn't have time for all the sports except for, he was actually very good at golf, but he was also an excellent swimmer. He had the championship up there in the backstroke. And let's face it, that's what allowed him to be a hero, his swimming ability. And so he had all these complications. And, but one thing I want to talk about is my main thought here today is about learning. You know, Arthur Sledge, we think of these politicians as naturals. This is the biggest nonsense in the world. Bill Clinton was such a natural, he got bounced as a governor of Arkansas. He got bounced running for Congress. I mean, he had to learn the business. It's something you can learn and get good at. Jack Kennedy had to learn to speak in public. He used to practice in his bathtub, making seal sounds, and so he could deepen his voice. He would listen to Churchill records over and over again. He had a voice coach right up until the debates in 1960. You have to learn this business. You had to learn how to meet people. He had a big advantage because in the Navy he met with a lot of regular guys, not just aristocrats that he'd gone to school with, and Ivy Leaguers. He got to know regular people who'd gone to state universities. He got to know them. They call themselves weed leaguers. Like they had the Ivy Leaguers and the weed leaguers, they call themselves. These are all the Navy guys he worked with. And he managed to get to be good at politics because he said, I'm going to learn this business. In 1956, he almost won the Democratic nomination for vice president, but the leaders turned against him. So he said, now I'm going to become a total politician. So he went around the country, met 30,000 people, he and Ted Sorensen, and kept index cards on everyone on a scale of 1 to 10 whether they liked him or not. He started building up personal relations with practically half the delegates to the 60 convention. He learned how to move governors around through intimidation. He had a great ally, Bobby Kennedy, who was frightening. And he sent Bobby in like a mobster to these other people that would give him a hard time. Governor Lawrence of Pennsylvania was giving him a hard time. He came up here and won the primary in the spring of 1960 in a write-in campaign, won over 70% of the vote, and Lawrence still wouldn't support him. Lawrence was Catholic, first Catholic governor of the state, scared to death. He would shake his own position loose, so he wouldn't back Kennedy. He was for somebody else, Stevenson at the time. So Kennedy went to work on him, working through the Boston Philly, and then basically taking his delegates away from him at a meeting in Pittsburgh. So intimidation, he would have a couple of governors like DeSalle of Ohio would go in the room with him and come out Kennedy supporters after Bobby was finished with him. And the same thing with the governor of Maryland. It was scary. One of the guys, the governor of Maryland, looked back, was hoping somebody else would come in the room besides Bobby. No, it was just him and Bobby. And God knows what Bobby said to these guys, but I think Obama could use a Bobby. He learned the business. He learned everything, how to speak in public, how to work other politicians, how to get to know regular people. He was excellent at it. He learned all the way until he had to learn the really tougher business of politics after the Bay of Pigs crisis, an actual catastrophe of 1961, when he learned for the first time in his life that the people working around him were not his allies, that the CIA was working for the CIA, the military was working for the military, and he was being used. They tried to trick him into invading Cuba in 1961 by getting the 1,500 exiles, Cuban exiles, on the beach with the idea that we would have to go in and help the exiles to save them. And Kennedy failed to ask the right question, which was how many regular Army Cuban troops will meet those 1,500 exiles the first day? And all he had to do was ask that one question, which he never asked, and he would have known the situation. The answer was 25,000. So how were 1,500 guys going to establish a beachhead with 25,000 regular troops hitting them on their own territory? They weren't, and they didn't, but he never asked the question. He was told that if they weren't able to grab a beachhead, they could retreat into the mountains. What the people didn't tell him, the CIA, was there was 80 miles of swamp right off the beach. They weren't going to be able to retreat into the mountains. And so he was sold a bill of goods, but he should have known better. He should have asked the right questions. After the Bay of Pigs disaster of 1961, he went to the American people and said, I was the officer in charge. And his poll numbers went to 83% approval. There's another lesson for President Obama. Admit it when it doesn't work out. And people do respect that. They respect the fact that if you don't admit mistakes, you don't admit your learning, you don't show your learning. Because how could you be learning if you never made any mistakes and improved upon it? And if you can't admit your learning, the second term won't be better than the first. And if it's not going to be better than this term, you ain't going to get one. That's what you have to do in politics. You have to build the case that you're learning and improving, and your experience counts for something when you run for re-election. That's what Kennedy was doing at the time he was killed. Now, the great thing about Kennedy, and the great thing every student here would understand, is the power of learning. That there are no naturals in most fields that matter. Most fields are mastered by the people who study and practice and learn from mistakes and get better at it and better at it and better at it. So when they're older, they're better. And they're better each year than the year before. And that's true of being a doctor, a dentist, anything, a lawyer. You must read the journals, and you must get better, and you must learn from experience. And you must admit that you're learning, and admit all the way you're learning from mistakes so you don't make them again. And that's what life is. And that's what Kennedy was like. The last day of his life, he was in Dallas, Texas, driving to the airport with Jim Wright, the congressman at the time, was a friend of mine, and his former speaker, and John Connally, the governor. And you know what he was doing? He was doing what he always did with Tip O'Neill, what he's always doing with Lou Harris's pollster, asking questions over and over again. How do you do this? How do you do it? How do you poll? How are the Portuguese going to vote in this election? How are the Lebanese going to vote? How are the Jewish people going to vote? Constantly trying to figure out voting patterns. That's what he did with Tip. And he did the same thing with Lou Harris. How do you poll people? How do you know how to, based on a sample? How do you do the random sample? How do you do that? How does it work? Always asking questions, curiosity, reading enormous numbers of newspapers every day, trying to learn what he needs to learn. There are no naturals, George W. There are no naturals. If you're going to be the decider, you better be the student as well. And so the last day, he was trying to figure out, why is Dallas, Texas so right-wing? He was saying, we're going into nut country, he told Jackie that morning. We're going into nut country. Why is it so right-wing? Now, he ended up being killed by a communist, but the atmospherics then were like they are now at a Tea Party meeting. Angry, people all calling him a traitor. He looked up and picked the newspaper up this morning. It's all about him being a traitor. And so, you know, his ambassador to the UN was spat upon, Adlai Stevenson. It was a very bad environment. It's like today, but not as bad as it was last year. Last year was the worst. So it was an interesting environment, and he was trying to figure things out to the end. What I'm most impressed by Jack Kennedy was that he learned. Now, here are 4 things the current president, I think, can learn from this president, and I think they're very valuable to anybody to learn. The presidency of the United States is not an IQ test. It's not about who the smartest person in the world. If it is, then Obama's got the right job for him. He's smart. He's probably got a really high IQ. He's really a whiz. Great. But it's not that. The job isn't IQ. It's not genius. It's leadership. It's not about he. It's about we. Can he lead us? And if he can't lead us, he shouldn't be president. It's about leading people. It's about getting people to do something as a people and feel it and do it every day. Be part of something called a war effort, like in World War II. Kennedy knew how to do that. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Obama's never done that. He dismissed us on inaugural day. He said, I'm president now, you all can go home. Watch me. Watch how good I am. That's totally the opposite of leading a country. Leading a country is asking people to join the Peace Corps, asking them to join the Special Forces. To explain to people have to go back on alert. They have to be activated again for the Berlin crisis. It's asking people to do anything that participates. It's what we grew up in knowing about in World War II. You buy war bonds, you collect metal, you collect scrap paper, you do something you work in a factory, you do something for the war effort. Right now, the military of this country is isolated. It's less than 0.5%, and nobody cares about, unless their family's involved, about what our soldiers are doing over there, on post, scared to death in some cases, defending the country as they know it, obeying orders. But the country feels like, do we know these people? This country has not been united by this president. We should all be part of any war we're in, or we should end the war that day. Unless all the American people are interested in being part of a war effort of some kind on some basis, we shouldn't be fighting wars. Wars shouldn't be run by surrogate armies. And that's what I view. And that's the big mistake of this president. We're going to keep these wars going, get everybody involved somehow, and talk about it all the time. Remind everybody we're at war in Afghanistan still. The people are still fighting. We never get reminded. We have press conference after press conference, but it never comes up. He should bring it up every time. Oh, by the way, we're fighting a war. People are involved, fighting for you. Think about it. And think of things for people to do. Kennedy was always asking, and everybody who ever served in the Kennedy campaign or served in the Peace Corps, like us, never forgets it, because you invested in something. And if you ask people to invest, they feel great. People don't mind being used. People like being used. They hate being discarded. I heard that from a guy who was in the Peace Corps where he told me that's the way he thought about girls. Nobody likes being discarded. Nobody. He has no political allies. I watch Sunny television. I mean, I watch Meet the Press, I watch those shows, Face the Nation. I never see anybody come on and say, I'm an Obama guy. I'm with Obama. Get off his back. These other guys are a bunch of bums. Say that. A little partisanship, a little support for the president. You never hear anybody say, Pelosi, is she with Obama? Are they in the same party? Is Harry Reid in the same party as Obama? I don't know. Is Durbin even in the same party? Is Maxine Waters, are they in some other political party? You never hear him say we. You never hear him say because he's never asked them. And he never invites anybody to the White House. He never forges any deals. He never hangs out with anybody because he really doesn't like them. And they get it. You don't like me? Fine. He doesn't phone me up and ask me to do something? Fine. Confederates. You must have political Confederates. You must have allies. I think the cabinet thinks it's under the Hatch Act. I don't know anybody in the cabinet who ever says anything for him. They never bring his name up. Hillary's become the most loyal, actually. She says good things about him lately. What's Vilsack do for a living? Is he a public servant? Is he in the civil service? What's Sabella? Is she in the civil service? Is she a civil servant or is she a political appointment? What is this crowd? They're above politics? I think they're below it. You got to be loyal to the president, put you in there, and you got to build his case, or else you're just not part of his team. And if you're not part of his team, I don't know what they're doing there. This is positive politics. This is the stupid, negative Eric Cantor politics and Tea Party crap. This is about positive politics. Support people. Urge support for the president's program. You just don't hear it from any of them. It's blindingly silent, this administration. I've never seen a bunch of amateurs like this. They don't act positively like politicians. 3, admit mistakes, because then people know you're learning. All right, the stimulus package didn't do what it promised it would do. How about just saying that? Everybody knows it. There's no secret anymore. Just say it. I'm learning. It didn't quite work. I said 8% unemployment. It's 9. I get it. I wish it were 7. Just say it. I'm working on this thing. It doesn't hurt to show you're learning. 4th, give us a little reason for optimism. You saved the American auto industry. How about telling people about it? Tell Romney about it. He was against saving it. Remind people some things work, and when they do work, brag a little. I don't think he knows how to do that. I don't know why he doesn't. Fifth, tell us why you want a second term. Show us where you're going. If you didn't have any Tea Party in front of you, if nobody was opposing you, what would Obama be? What would you do to the long-term problems of Medicare and Medicaid? What would you do about Social Security? Tell us how you would fix it if there was no opposition out there. Let us know what you believe. We always knew what Reagan would do. We knew what Clinton wanted. You knew what good presidents want to do. You always know what they want to do. Every cab driver knew Ronald Reagan wanted to crush the Soviet Union, reduce taxes, and reduce the size of government. Every single person knew that. What do you want to do, Mr. President? Why are you there? Why do you want to be president a second term? What's your plan? Is it going to be better than this? Tell us. Explain. He never does. I've never heard him explain what he wants to do with the tax system. Tell us, you want to get rid of capital gains treatment? Fine. It's 19%. You want to raise it? Say so. For people whose primary source of income is coupon clipping, raise the tax rate? Say so. Don't do all this Buffett rule and all this BS. Tell us what you want to do. He doesn't do it. He has never explained his long-term debt reduction plan or his short-term stimulus plan. This little fix a few bridges thing isn't going to be the answer. Nobody believes that. It's not big enough to fight over. I don't understand it. Why? He's a brilliant guy, probably the brightest president we've had in a long time. And he never explains what he wants to do. Jack Kennedy, the day before he got killed, said the Irish kids used to throw their caps over the orchard wall, so they'd have to go over the top of the wall to get the cap. It was a trick to get them to do something. What are you throwing your cap over the wall for? Jack Kennedy was pushing civil rights when he died, a tax cut, the space program. He was going to the moon. He was building Saturn rockets big enough to get us there. He was going around the world with the Peace Corps to try to win the Cold War peaceably. He was building the Alliance for Progress in Latin America. Everything had a goal. You didn't have to ask Kennedy what he was going to do because you could see what he was doing. And that's where he was taking us. In every sphere of American life, you knew what Kennedy was trying to do because he was doing it. I'm not sure what a second term of Obama looks like, Mr. President. Tell us. It'd be smart. So I'm here to cause trouble. And you won't know what political party I'm in, except that I'd like to see a better government. I think Kennedy belongs on Mount Rushmore. I think he was a hero president. I think he made us feel really great to be Americans, and we knew what a hero looked like. He was a guy that saved his crew and saved the planet against the people around him that wanted to give up. It's a great thing to be an American. It's a great thing to be an American hero. I know what they look like. I wrote a book about Jack Kennedy, and I want you to read it to feel as strong as I do about what I just said. Because I think after you've read this book, you're going to be just as angry as I am that we're not living up to his standards. Because they are reachable, they are doable, and they are learnable. Politics is not about IQ. It's about courage and the willingness to learn, and to learn from mistakes, and to set goals worthy for all of us, and to think not about me, but about we. And every time you hear Obama say I, you know he's in trouble. And every time he says we, if he ever starts to say it, you know he's on the road to victory. Thank you very much. Thank you.